There is a silence that has nothing to do with the absence of noise. It is the silence that forms when someone finally decides they will no longer pretend, no longer act as though they did not hear the whisper behind the door, did not see the glance across the table, did not feel themselves being folded smaller and smaller to fit inside a life that was never meant for them. That silence is not empty. It is dense. It gathers weight year after year, and when it finally breaks, when the person carrying it finds a way to release it, the sound can travel farther than any scream or gunshot. Because sometimes it does not travel through air, it travels through ink and paper. What follows is the account of a woman named Dora. In the 1850s, she worked as a cook on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. For nearly 20 years, she prepared meals for a family who never cared to ask her surname. She stirred their stews, salted their meat, baked their bread, and listened. When a person is treated as part of the furniture, those in power forget she is present. They spoke freely around her. They confided carelessly. They assumed invisibility meant ignorance. They told her nothing. They told her everything. In the summer of 1857, something happened that historians and archivists would later argue over for decades. In 1923, workers clearing out an old oak chest discovered a false bottom. Hidden inside was a bundle of handwritten pages. Dora had written it all down. Every conversation overheard, every secret kept, every night she had stood still and silent while pretending not to understand. This is her story. Stay with it, because what unsettles people most about Belhaven Plantation is not simply what Dora witnessed. It is what occurred after others discovered she had recorded it. Belhaven stood 12 miles south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on land carved into productivity through years of labor its owner preferred not to examine too closely. Gerald Havfield did not dwell on the hands that cut the cane. He thought instead about harvest totals, market prices in New Orleans, the weight of sugar barrels, rainfall, and soil conditions. He trained himself to see profit without seeing the people who produced it, like someone who reads a clock face without ever imagining the gears turning behind it. By 1857, Gerald was 53 years old. His skin was permanently flushed from long days riding under the southern sun and long evenings spent on the veranda with bourbon in hand. He was not overtly sadistic, not cruel in the theatrical sense. He was something quieter and perhaps more dangerous, a man who simply chose not to look. He did not look at the workers bent over the cane fields. He did not examine the grey ledger maintained by his overseer. He did not meet the eyes of the women who carried his meals up the back steps of the house. For 18 years, Dora had made that walk. She arrived at Belhaven in 1839, around 19 years old. The estate records from her previous place of enslavement were sparse, more meticulous about livestock than about human lives. But she came with a skill already honed. She knew how to cook. In her former kitchen, precision had been mandatory. Measurements mattered. Timing mattered. Taste mattered. Dora learned quickly that competence could create a narrow but vital margin of safety. A poor cook invited punishment. An exceptional one was granted a fragile autonomy. Excellence, she discovered, could function as armor. By the summer of 1857, Dora was likely in her mid to late 30s. She managed the plantation kitchen with disciplined efficiency, understanding that the only territory she could truly claim was the one she secured through mastery. The kitchen house stood separate from the main residence, a common arrangement on Louisiana plantations. Practically, it reduced fire risk. Socially, it reinforced distance. The building sat about 40 feet from the rear entrance of the main house. Between them stretched a covered walkway, a pergola threaded with jasmine vines that bloomed white and fragrant from April through October. Dora walked that path countless times each day, carrying trays balanced carefully in her hands. She moved quietly. She listened constantly. And all the while, she remembered.
And the thing about that path?
The thing that mattered enormously, though no one who designed the architecture had considered it, was that the rear windows of Gerald Haffield's study sat directly above the back steps where the path ended. Gerald Haffield conducted much of his private business in that study. He conducted it with the windows open because the Louisiana summer heat was relentless, and because he had over 18 years completely ceased to register Dora's presence in the way one ceases to register the sound of a clock ticking in a room they've slept in for years. This was his most consequential error. Dora had been born into a world that required her to make constant, rapid calculations about what she knew, what she could say, and what she was required to pretend not to know. This was not unique to her. It was the particular intelligence that the system demanded from people in her position, a kind of perpetual exhausting vigilance that went unacknowledged because it was invisible, and because acknowledging it would have required the people around her to admit it existed. She knew things about the Havfield family that they believed were known only to themselves. She knew that Gerald's eldest son, Philip, 26, handsome in the way of men who have always been handsome, and have done nothing interesting with it, was 3 months behind on debts he had accumulated in New Orleans that his father did not know about. She knew this because Philip had received 2 letters in the spring of that year, and she had been standing at the bottom of the main staircase when he read them, and the sound a man makes when he reads a letter that frightens him is distinctive, and she had listened. She knew that Gerald's wife, Cecily, a thin, precise woman from a Virginia family that had once had more land and prestige than money, and who had spent 20 years married to Gerald, compensating for what she privately considered a social disappointment, had been writing letters to her sister in Richmond that she did not send through the usual post. She sent them through a trusted friend in Baton Rouge, who posted them from there. Cecily had mentioned this arrangement in a conversation with that friend in the parlor of the main house one afternoon, speaking in the lowered tones that polite Southern women used when they wished to be discreet, not realizing that lowered tones in a house with wooden floors and high ceilings carry differently than they imagine, and that Dora had been in the hallway outside the parlor door. Oh, Stinger Tray! She knew that Gerald's younger son, Robert, 19, narrow, and possessed of a nervous intelligence that made everyone in the household slightly uncomfortable, had been spending time in parts of the parish that his father would not have approved of, meeting with people his father would not have approved of, and reading documents that could have caused serious difficulties for the entire family. Had they come to the attention of certain men in Baton Rouge? She knew all of this, the way a river knows the shape of its banks passively, continuously, without being asked. And she had kept it the way water keeps the shape of a vessel, perfectly. And why? Without effort. For 18 years, what Dora knew had stayed inside her. It had no outlet. It had nowhere to go. She was a cook on a plantation in Louisiana in the 1850s, and the idea that she might share what she knew with anyone who could do something useful with it was so structurally impossible that it barely formed as a thought. It was simply weight, something she carried until the summer of 1857, when 3 things happened in rapid succession that changed the nature of what she was carrying from weight into something more dangerous, something with edges. The first thing happened in June. A man arrived at Belhaven who had not been expected. His name was Cyrus Hole, and he was, by his own description, a business associate of Gerald Havfield's from Memphis, come south on a matter of some delicacy. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon on horseback, with a leather satchel that he kept close to his person at all times, and a manner that Dora, who had a long experience with the difference between men who were comfortable and men who were pretending to be comfortable, recognized immediately as the latter. Gerald Havfield received Cyrus Holt in his study with the windows open because it was June in Louisiana, and the alternative was suffocating. Dora walked the jasmine path 3 times that afternoon. She did not slow down. She did not position herself deliberately beneath the window. She simply walked at her usual pace, carrying what she was carrying. And she listened to what the open window offered her, because she had learned long ago that the best way to hear things was not to appear to be trying. What she heard in fragments, the natural fragments of a person walking beneath a window rather than standing still, was enough. Cyrus Holt had come about a debt, not Philip's debt, which was the debt of a young man who drank too much and played cards badly. This was a different kind of day, BT of a different magnitude. Gerald Havfield had, it appeared, entered into an arrangement some years prior with a group of men whose business interests were, to put it in the language of 1857, Louisiana, irregular. The arrangement had been profitable for several years. It was no longer profitable, and the men Cyrus Holt represented were not patient men. And the figure that passed through the open window and reached Dora's ears as she walked beneath it was large enough that she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt frightened for the family, not because she cared for them. Exactly. It was something more complicated than care. It was the fear of the servant for the household, the particular anxiety of knowing that if the house falls, everyone inside it falls differently. But everyone falls. She took the food inside and said nothing. The second thing happened in early July. It involved Robert. Robert Havfield had been for the past year quietly and carefully doing something that in 1857 Louisiana was not merely socially unacceptable, but actively dangerous. He had been attending meetings, not political meetings in any formal sense, not the kind of meetings that men of his family standing attended in town with other men of similar standing to talk about yields and tariffs and the price of things. Different meetings, small gatherings in back rooms and private homes, the kind of meetings that left no public record, and that participants referred to in correspondence only obliquely, in language that required a shared understanding to decode. Dora had known about Robert's activities for several months. She had seen the looks he exchanged with certain visitors. She had noticed which letters he opened before bringing them to his father's attention, and which he pocketed. She had observed the pattern of his absences, but in early July something changed. A man came to the rear of the kitchen house. Not the main entrance, not the formal approach that any legitimate visitor would use, but the back through the vegetable garden, in the late evening when the light was going, and the household was moving toward the routines that preceded sleep. He was a slight man, older than Robert, with calloused hands and a deliberate, careful way of moving. He had come to speak with Dora, not about Robert, about something Robert was carrying. The man, he gave no name. And Dora did not ask for one, because she understood that names in this kind of conversation were dangerous things. Explained that Robert had taken something he ought not to have taken, something that had been entrusted to the movement that Robert had attached himself to, and that this something needed to be returned or forwarded without going through Robert, who had in recent weeks become unreliable in ways that alarmed the people who depended on him. The man asked Dora if she would be willing to help. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the jasmine path and the open window, and 18 years of walking quietly and hearing everything and carrying it alone. She said she would think about it. The man left the way he had come through the vegetable garden, and Dora stood in her kitchen for a long time after, listening to the sound of the house settling in the heat. She was thinking, but she was also, for the first time in a very long time, remembering what it felt like to be asked. The third thing happened in the middle of July. It was the thing that changed everything. And it began with a conversation she was not supposed to hear in a room she was not supposed to be near. At a time when everyone in the main house believed she was in the kitchen, she was not in the kitchen. She was at the bottom of the back staircase, having come up through the rear entrance to replace the candles in. The hallway sconces, a task she typically performed in the afternoon, but which she had been delayed in doing because of preparations for a dinner that Gerald Hatfield was hosting that evening. It was past 4 o'clock. The hallway was dim, the shutters half closed against the afternoon heat. The study door was not fully latched. Gerald and Cyrus Holt were inside. Cyrus had not left after his June visit. He had stayed, which was itself unusual, and his continued presence had created a tension in the household that had been building for weeks. Gerald had told Cecily that Holt was helping with business matters, and Cecily, whose intelligence was considerable, but whose access to her husband's affairs was structurally limited, had accepted this explanation with the particular expression of a woman who has learned not to ask questions and has trained herself not to regret not asking them. But this afternoon, through the unlatched study door, what Dora heard was not about the debt she already knew about. It was about a man who lived in Baton Rouge, a man who was, according to Cyrus Holt, asking questions he should not be asking. A man who had begun making inquiries about a series of transactions that connected Gerald Hatfield to the group of men whose representative Holt was transactions that had occurred over a period of years, and that involved things that, if exposed in the right way to the right people, would destroy Gerald Hatfield entirely and implicate several other men of similar standing in the parish. Cyrus Hole was explaining in a voice that was very calm and very precise what he believed should be done about this man. Gerald Hatfield did not respond immediately. There was a long silence. Then he said something in a voice so low that Dora at the base of the stairs caught only part of it. The part she caught was enough. She stood very still. She finished replacing the candles. She walked back down the hall and out through the rear entrance and down the jasmine path to the kitchen house. She stoked the fire under the pot for the evening's dinner. She stirred. She salted. She thought about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions. She thought about the man who had come through the vegetable garden and asked if she would help. She thought about Philip's debts, and Chazal's secret letters, and Robert's dangerous meetings, and 18 years of knowing and carrying and staying silent, and she began, in the back of her mind, to compose. If you've been listening this far, stay with us, because what Dora had collected over 18 years is about to become the most dangerous inventory you've ever heard of. And we're just getting started. The thing about being invisible in a house is that you are not actually invisible. You are simply categorized differently. You are furniture. You are appliance. You are part of the mechanism, and mechanisms are not expected to observe. So no one accounts for the fact that they do. Dora had been observing since 1839. She had a memory that she had never been given credit for, because she had never been given the opportunity to demonstrate it. She could recall conversations from years past with the fidelity of a court stenographer. The exact words, the exact tone, the exact silences that fell between words, and that sometimes said more than the words themselves. This was not a gift she had cultivated for any particular purpose. It was something she had developed the way anyone develops a skill that keeps them safe by necessity. And over time, let us consider what Dora knew by the summer of 1857. She knew the full architecture of Gerald Hatfield's financial life, not because anyone had explained it to her, but because financial anxiety is one of the loudest things a household can contain, and it expresses itself in third, quality of meals requested, in the length of conversations conducted in the study after supper, in the way a man's shoulders sit when he comes to the dinner table. She had watched Gerald's body tell the story his mouth would not tell for years. She knew that Belhaven had been mortgaged in 1853. She knew this because she had overheard Gerald dictating a letter to his Clara that spring, and because she had seen the clerk's face when he returned to the plantation 3 days after posting it. And because when a man's face looks the way that Clark's face looked, the news is never good. She knew that the sugar yields had been declining since 1854. She knew this because of the dinner conversations, the way Gerald talked about the cane when the yields were good, expansively with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who equates his land's production with his own virtue, versus the way he talked about it in recent years, briefly with a deflective quality, steering the conversation toward other things. She knew that Gerald had been entertaining men from New Orleans who were not the usual sort of men he entertained. She had served these men. She had watched them. They arrived in good clothes, and they had the manners of men accustomed to being accommodated. But beneath the manners, there was something else, a patience that was not the patience of men waiting for something good, but the patience of men who were certain of an outcome. She had learned over many years to distinguish between these two kinds of patience. The men from New Orleans had come several times between 1853 and 1856. After 1856, they stopped coming to Belhaven. Instead, Cyrus Holt came. This distinction was not lost on Dora. What Dora knew about Philip was at its core the story of a young man who had been given everything except the capacity to manage it. Philip Haverfield had grown up as the heir to something. The plantation, the position, the particular social standing that came with owning land and being white in Louisiana in the middle of the 19th century. He had grown up knowing he would have these things, and this knowledge had produced in him a confidence that was real but hollow. The way a building can look solid from the outside, while the interior structure is compromised. He had gone to New Orleans for the first time at 18 and had returned different. Not obviously so. Not in ways his parents would have immediately recognized, but different in the way that a person is different when they have discovered something about themselves that their family's world has no vocabulary for. Dora had recognized the change immediately. She had seen it in the way he ate hurriedly, as though meals were interruptions, and in the way he moved through the plantation house restlessly, as though he were always on his way somewhere else, always waiting to leave. He had been going to New Orleans regularly since then. He brought back gifts for his mother, excuses for his father, and debts that grew with each trip, with the patient consistency of compound interest. The men he owed money to were not men who would wait indefinitely. Dora knew this not from overhearing any conversation about them specifically, but from the quality of the letters that arrived for Philip, the ones he received and immediately burned, rather than leaving them on the desk in his room. She knew letters were burned because she was responsible for cleaning the fireplaces and burned paper leaves of particular ash. By July of 1857, the ash in Philip's fireplace was accumulating at a rate that told a story all by itself. Chesley, however, Field was the most complicated person in Dora's world, and the one she had spent the most time thinking about. She was not a bad woman. Dora had decided this years ago, with the careful objectivity of someone who has had ample time and close proximity to make an assessment. Cecily was a woman who had made her choices within the narrow set of choices available to women of her position in her time, and she had made them efficiently and without visible regret, which is not the same as making them happily. She ran the household with a precision that bordered on compulsion. Every surface in the main house was maintained at a standard that required constant effort from the people who maintained it. She entertained with a graciousness that guests remembered and remarked on. She dressed carefully and spoke carefully and managed the family social relationships with the strategic attentiveness of a diplomat. But she was not happy. Dora knew this the way she knew most things about the family, from proximity and observation. She knew it from the way Cecily sat at the breakfast table when Gerald had already gone out for the morning, the particular quality of stillness that came over her, the way she would hold her coffee cup with both hands and look out the window at the garden and not see anything she was looking at. The letters to her sister in Richmond were the most revealing thing about Cecily, and they were also the most dangerous, because the sister in Richmond was not writing back through the usual channels either. And the letters the sister was sending, which arrived occasionally, addressed in a hand that Cecily always took directly, never leaving on the front table where the mail was usually sorted, were not ordinary letters. Dora did not know their full content. She was not in the habit of reading letters that were not addressed to her, and in any case, Cecily kept hers private in a way that would have made access difficult. But she knew something of their content from Chesal's responses to them, from the way Chesal's posture changed after reading them. The F.E. way, she would sometimes go directly to the writing desk in the parlor after reading, and write immediately, with a speed and energy that was different from her usual correspondence. The sister in Richmond was helping Cecily plan something. Dora did not know what, but she had been watching the pattern for almost a year, and patterns in her experience always resolved eventually into something recognizable. Robert was the one who worried her most, not because of the danger of what he was involved in, though that danger was real, and she understood it clearly. What worried her about Robert was something more specific, the gap between his intelligence and his judgment. He was a genuinely bright young man. She had seen this since his childhood, in the way he read voraciously, systematically, with the absorption of someone who was not performing literacy for social purposes, but actually consuming ideas. He had grown up in a household where the library was well stocked and largely decorative, and he had worked through a significant portion of it by the time he was 15, which was how he had encountered the ideas that had quietly, thoroughly reorganized his understanding of the world he had been born into. The problem was that his intelligence had outpaced his caution. He had become involved with people who were doing serious, dangerous work, with a care and discretion forged in the awareness of exactly what the consequences of exposure were. Robert, who had come to these ideas through reading rather than experience, had not yet developed that same bone-deep understanding of consequence. He was careful in the way a person is careful when they understand a rule intellectually, not the way a person is careful when they have watched what happens to people who are not. The man who had come through the vegetable garden in July had said Robert was becoming unreliable. He had not elaborate, but Dora understood what the word meant in the context. Unreliable did not mean disloyal. It meant careless. And careless in 1857, Louisiana was a word with consequences that extended far beyond the person being careless. She had watched Robert at dinner in the weeks following the man's visit. She watched the way he listened when his father talked with a contained intensity that to Gerald probably looked like attentiveness, but that Dora recognized as something else entirely. He did not come for a reason related to food. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in a way that he rarely looked at her directly, with the quality of someone who is seeing rather than merely looking. He asked if she had a few minutes. She said she did. He came inside and sat at the corner of the kitchen work table, the corner where the light from the window was good, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she would write down later, after the fact, in her own words, in the space of a letter she sent through a channel she will not specify here, a letter that ended up as part of a later archive, and which is why we have our account of what he said. Dora, I need you to know that whatever happens in the next few weeks, I'm going to make sure that the people in the quarters know what they need to know to make the right choices. He paused. "I need you to know that I know it matters." She looked at him. She said, "What's going to happen in the next few weeks?" He looked at his hands. He said, "I'm not sure of all of it, but things are going to change." She said, "Things always change, Mr. Robert." He looked up at that. He said, "Not like this." She did not tell him about the pages. She looked at him and thought about the 14-year-old boy in the stables who had written them, and about the oilcloth and the false bottom and the oak chest, and the 15 years of empty pace that had finally, in the last month of summer, been put to use. She said, "I know." He left. She went back to the fire. On the 14th of September, two things happened. The first, a stranger came to the plantation. He arrived in the late morning on a hired horse, carrying a document that he required Gerald Havfield to sign for, which meant he had to be admitted to the study, which meant Dora was informed of his presence by the girl who managed the front entrance, who came to tell Dora that a visitor had arrived so that Dora could prepare a refreshment tray. Dora prepared the tray. She walked through the house. She set the tray on the hallway table outside the study and knocked. Gerald's voice said, "Come." She entered with the tray, set it on the side table, and left. The operation took approximately 45 seconds. In those 45 seconds, she saw the stranger clearly. She saw the document on Gerald's desk partially unrolled. She saw Gerald's expression. The stranger was from Baton Rouge. She did not know this absolutely, but she was near certain, from a detail she had observed that she could not explain without revealing more than she wishes to explain here. A small, specific, observable detail that told us something about where he had come from. Gerald's expression was the expression of a man who has received what he feared and has been required to receive it in the presence of a witness and cannot show what he feels. She left the study. She walked down the hall. She went back to the kitchen. The second thing that happened that day, Cyrus Hole left Belhaven. He left quietly in the afternoon with his horse and his leather satchel. He said goodbye to no one that Dora was aware of. He simply was there and then was not there, which in itself was a kind of information. You've come this far with us. What happens in the next days is the part that explains why these pages were sealed away for decades. Stay with us. The household held its breath. Dora had never felt this quality in a place so strongly before, not even during the difficult periods of previous years, not even during the financial troubles of 1853 or the illness that had swept the quarters in 1855 and killed 4 people in 6 weeks. This was different. This was the specific quality of held breath that preceded not the usual difficulties of the plantation year, but something structural, something that would change the shape of things. She continued cooking. She continued walking the jasmine path. She continued each time she walked it, listening through the windows that were always open because it was September in Louisiana, and the heat had not broken yet. Gerald had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual taciturnity. He was in the study most of the day and in the evenings, which was not unusual, but the quality of his presence in the house had changed. It had a density to it, a concentration, the way a storm has density before it breaks, and the house felt heavier around him. Cecily was writing. She was writing more letters than Dora had ever seen her write, working at the parlor desk with a speed and continuity that was remarkable. She sealed them herself and walked them to the front door herself and gave them to the houseboy to take into town, which was unusual. She usually left outgoing correspondence on the front table. She was not going through the usual post. Robert was absent most of the day. He left early and returned late on foot rather than on horseback, and came in through the rear entrance rather than the front, which told her something about where he had been, and more importantly, with whom. On the 18th of September, 3 men arrived who were not invited for supper, but ended up sitting in the dining room for 3 hours. Dora cooked for them. She sent the foe. Odd in through the back staircase as usual. She waited in the kitchen while they ate and talked. She came back to clear as usual. When she came to clear, the men were still at the table. She moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms. Efficiently, quietly, without the particular weight of presence that requires acknowledgement. She cleared plates. She sat down the dessert course. She refilled glasses. The conversation continued around her with an occasional lapse. Not quite a pause, but an adjustment. A slight narrowing in the breadth of what was said while she was in the room. This was the standard adjustment that people made in her presence. A compromise between the desire to speak freely and the awareness that she was present, resolved in the usual direction, assuming that her presence was equivalent to absence. She was not absent. What she heard in those lapses and adjustments was the outline of a situation that by September of 1857 had become something she had not quite anticipated, even with everything she knew. The document from the stranger on the 14th had not been what she had thought it was. It was not from the man in Baton Rouge. It was from a different direction entirely. It pertained to a different part of Gerald Haffield's arrangement, the part that involved August Fry. She heard the name. She heard it said with the same calculated precision she had first heard it in 1855, and now it had context. And the context made the weight of those 2 years of keeping the name feel suddenly, vertiginously significant. August Fry was an agent. He worked variously, and with great flexibility of allegiance, for several different interests. And the interest he had most recently been working for was one that had been investigating the arrangement between Gerald Hiverfield and the men from New Orleans for the better part of 2 years. She cleared the table. Shh! E went back to the kitchen. She stood at the fire and thought about a name she had kept for 2 years, and what it meant that it had finally showed her what it was. On the 22nd of September, Robert did not come home. He had left that morning as usual on foot through the rear, and by supper he had not returned, and by the time the household closed up for the night and the lamps were extinguished, he was still not back. Gerald did not send anyone to look for him. This was the detail that told her the most. In a household where the heir's movements had always been tracked with the anxious attention of parents who understood that their son's behavior had consequences for the family standing, the absence of a search was not an oversight. Gerald knew where Robert was, or he knew in broad terms what had happened to Robert's presence, and he had decided deliberately, with whatever feeling was behind that decision, to let the absence stand. She did not sleep well that night. In the days that followed, the plantation operated on its surface as it always had. The cane was at the stage in the growing season that required a particular kind of attention. The kitchen produced 3 meals a day. The household routine continued its rhythm. But underneath the surface, Dora felt the structure of things shifting. Chesley had received a letter that made her, for an afternoon, stop pretending. She sat in the parlor with the letter in her lap, and her hands in her lap, and her face doing something she did not manage to smooth back into its usual composed arrangement, before Dora had crossed the hall with a tray, and seen it. Dora sat down the tray and left without being dismissed, which was irregular, and Cecily did not call her back. October came. Philip did not return from New Orleans. Robert had sent word not to the main house, but to the quarters through channels that had their own architect, Ure, and their own efficiency, that he was safe, and that people should know certain things, and should make certain decisions accordingly. Dora heard this not from Robert directly, but from others, who heard from others in the way that information moved in the parts of the plantation that the main house did not think of as having channels. Gerald Hafffield received several more documents over the course of October. She knew this from the steady traffic of men with satchels coming through the front door, and from the weight of Gerald's silence at the occasional meals he still took in the dining room. He had stopped riding out in the mornings. He had stopped going into town. He was staying on the property with the quality of a man who is not staying by choice. Cyrus Hole did not return. The first week of November, two men arrived with a document that was different from all the others. They were not from New Orleans. They were not the kind of men who conducted the sort of business that had been conducted in that study for years. They were official men, in the particular way that officials looked in 1857. Louisiana, the quality of their dress, the way they sat their horses, the formality of their address when they presented themselves at the front door and asked to speak with Mr. Gerald Hatfield. Dora was in the kitchen when they arrived. She knew they had arrived from the sound, the particular sound of official men who have come with documents, which is different from the sound of ordinary visitors. She did not walk the jasmine path that morning. She did not need to. She knew with the deep certainty of someone who has been watching a pattern complete itself for months that what she had heard through the open window of that study in June and in July and at the bottom of the back staircase in the conversation through the unlatched door was now being heard by men who had the authority, yea, to do something about it. She stood at her fire and felt something that she examined carefully because she was not sure what it was. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was not vindication. It was something quieter than both of those things, and more complicated. It was the feeling of a record being made. Gerald Hatfield left Belhaven in November of 1857, under circumstances that the official record of the period describes in the dry, particular language of legal process. The details are not entirely clear from those records, because official records of the period were subject to the same incompleteness that Dora had noted in the records of her own life. Information was kept when it served the interests of the people who kept it, and omitted when it did not. What the records do show is that by early 1858, Belhaven was in the process of significant change. Legal proceedings had been initiated that would over the following years resolve into outcomes that were imperfect, as such things always were in that period and place, but that were not nothing. Robert Hatfield's name appears in a different context and in different records in the years that follow. He is associated with people and activities that his family's world would have found unforgivable, and he appears to have gone forward with this association without apparent concern for their opinion of it. Philip returned eventually to Louisiana, but not to Belhaven. Chesley went back to Virginia. The letters she had been writing to her sister in Richmond, letters that had been arranged through the friend in Baton Rouge and sent through a channel that bypassed the official post, revealed themselves, in the years that followed, to have been part of a careful preparation for precisely this outcome. Cecily Hatfield had, with the efficiency she brought to all things, made arrangements. She was a practical woman. The Dora remain. Ed at Belhaven through the transition period. This is one of the things that the pages make clear, or rather that the secondary account she sent through the later channel makes clear. The letter that arrived in an archive and was eventually connected through careful scholarship in the 1970s and 80s to the pages themselves. She stayed because the kitchen needed running, and the people in the quarters needed the kitchen running. And the chaos of a collapsing plantation structure has particular effects on the people who have the least structural protection within it. And she was not willing to add to those effects by leaving. She cooked, she kept the kitchen, she made sure there was food, and she waited. The pages themselves were found in 1923. The kitchen house at what had been the Belhaven Plantation had been standing since the 1840s, and it had survived the Civil War and Reconstruction and the long decades after in the condition of most outbuildings that are no longer used for their original purpose, intermittently maintained, gradually weathering, occasionally repurposed for storage. The main house had burned in 1871. The cause was officially listed as accidental, though there were people in the area who had their own account of events, which was never formally recorded. The kitchen house did not burn. In 1923, a woman named Agnes Turr Road, a schoolteacher in East Baton Rouge Parish, the granddaughter of a woman who had lived in the quarters at Belle Haven and who had been one of the people Dora was cooking for during the transition period, was helping to clear the old building, which was being demolished to make way for a different structure on land that had changed hands multiple times since the 1860s. Agnes found the chest. She found it because it was too heavy to move easily, and when she investigated why it was too heavy, she found the insert. And when she oved the insert, she found the space below, and in the space below she found the oiled cloth, and inside the oiled cloth she found the pages she could read. Her grandmother had made sure of that. She sat down on the floor of the old kitchen house with the pages in her lap, and she read them. It took her most of the afternoon. When she was done, she sat for a while without moving in the dusty light of the old building, with the pages in her hands. Then she made a decision that would take her years to fully execute, that would require her to navigate institutions that were not designed to receive what she had found. That would cost her more time and effort and occasional grief than she had anticipated when she sat on that floor. She decided to make sure the pages survived. Here is what we know and what we don't know, and the distance between these two things is where this story continues to live. We know that Dora existed. Agnes Turr's account of finding the pages written in a journal she kept from the 1920s through the 1950s is specific and detailed, and has been examined by people who know how to examine such things. The pages themselves, or rather photographs and transcriptions of them, because the originals are fragile and kept under conditions that protect their physical survival, have been seen by scholars of Southern history, archivists, and historians specializing in the period. The question of their authenticity has been examined. The paper, the ink, the writing, all are consistent with the materials and methods available in 1850s Louisiana. The handwriting shows the characteristics of a self-taught writer, which is consistent with Lenny's profile. The content contains specific details, names, financial figures, arrangements, the name August Fry, that have been cross-referenced with other records of the period, official records that the pages had no access to, and, yet, described with a consistency that is difficult to explain, except by concluding that the person dictating them had direct knowledge. August Frey, specifically, is a name that appears in a separate archival collection, a collection of records from an investigation conducted in 1857 and 1858 by a federal agent operating in Louisiana. Records that were themselves stored in an obscure archive and not widely known to scholars until the 1980s. The investigation involved several planters in the Baton Rouge area and a network of financial transactions that the pages describe. The name August Fry appears in both the pages and the federal investigation records. There is no way to explain this, except that Dora heard it and Lenny wrote it down. What we don't know is more extensive. We don't know with certainty what happened to Dora after the transition period. There are records that may pertain to her. A woman of her approximate description, approximate age, first name Dora, appears in documents from the early 1860s related to a community in a different part of Louisiana. These records cannot be definitively connected to the woman in the pages. The connection is plausible, but unproven. We don't know what happened to Lenny. The boy who wrote the pages appears in no record that can be specifically identified as him after the fall of 1857. This could mean many things. The most hopeful interpretation is that he, like Robert, moved into a different world and left fewer records because the world he moved into was one that kept different records. The less hopeful interpretations are the ones that the period makes available and that we do not need to specify to understand. We don't know the full content of the pages because some of them were damaged before Agnes too found them. Louisiana humidity had done work on the oiled cloth, and the outermost pages were partially illegible in places. The transcriptions that scholars have made are of the legible portions with notations of Loon. We don't know who the man in Baton Rouge was, who was asking questions that Cyrus Holt believed should be addressed with means beyond mere discouragement. The federal investigation record suggests several possibilities, but none of them can be confirmed as the specific person Dora overheard being discussed. We don't know and can never know how many conversations Dora heard that she did not put in the pages because they did not seem relevant, or because the 9 nights were finite, or because some things she carried in herself and chose not to externalize. The pages are what she chose to put outside herself. They are the record she decided to make. Everything beyond them is the larger archive that no system of records ever built was equipped to hold. The archive of what was known by people who were not supposed to know it, preserved in nothing but memory for no span of time except a lifetime. We're near the end now. But before we get there, there's something you need to know about what happened after Agnes found those pages. Because what she found wasn't just a document, it was a map of consequences. Stay with us. Agnes Turo spent the years from 1923 to 1938 doing something that required more patience and strategic intelligence than most of the activities that history tends to reward with recognition. She was trying to get someone with institutional standing to care about a bundle of handwritten pages found in the false bottom of a kitchen chest on a former Louisiana plantation. She approached libraries, she approached universities, she approached newspapers. She approached the offices of people she believed would understand the historical significance of what she had found. The responses she received ranged from polite disinterest to something less polite. This is not surprising. None. 1923 was not a moment in American history when the institutions she was approaching were particularly well configured to receive what she was offering. The South of the 1920s was a particular place, and Louisiana was a particular state within it. And the story that Dora's pages told was a story about a family whose descendants might still have interests and the ability to express them. She did not stop. She kept the pages safe, and she kept approaching people, and she kept a journal of her efforts that is as valuable in its own way as the pages themselves, because it documents the second layer of the story of what happens to truth after it is written down and before it is received. In 1938, she found someone, a young historian named Emmett Kavanaugh, at a small college in New Orleans, who was working on a study of Louisiana plantation economics in the Antebellum period, and who had encountered in the course of that research the federal investigation records that mentioned August Frey. He had been confused by that name, by its oblique significance in the records, and had been trying to understand it for several months. Agnes showed him the pages. He understood immediately. He also understood immediately that getting this material into a form that could survive institutional processes would require time and care, and a level of discretion that the material itself seemed in some way to call for. He and Agnes corresponded for several years. He cited the pages obliquely in a monograph published in 1941. He did not name his source, and Agnes was not named in the acknowledgments at her request, because she was a schoolteacher in a parish where being known as the person who had surfaced this material could have made her professional life considerably more difficult. This, too, is part of the story. The pages eventually reached an archive. In 1949, Agnes Turo deposited tea, hem, the originals carefully preserved in the oiled cloth she had also kept with a specific archive at a specific institution that she had spent years identifying as the most likely to hold them properly. An institution that had a particular commitment to collecting the records of people whose records were not usually collected, that had been founded with exactly this gap in the historical archive in mind. She accompanied the deposit with a written account of how she had found the pages, the story of her grandmother's connection to Belhaven, and the history of her efforts to find them a home. She also included the journal. All of this is now archived. All of it can be found by people who know where to look and have reason to look. The scholarly examination that produced the most complete account of what the pages contain, and of what they mean in the context of the other records they connect to, was published in 1987 by a historian whose name is in the public record and who spent several years working with the material in the archive. The account is careful and scholarly and methodologically precise. It does what serious historical scholarship is meant to do. It establishes provenance. It cross-references names, dates, and events. It admits uncertainty where certainty is impossible. It proposes an interpretation rather than forcing one. And yet, at its conclusion, it includes a passage that gestures beyond method toward something scholarship alone cannot fully explain. What is extraordinary about Dora's account is not simply that it was written, it is that it endured. The institutional machinery of the antebellum South was meticulously structured to prevent the creation of precisely this kind of testimony. The century that followed offered little more protection, that these pages survived at all borders on improbability, that a bundle of paper could travel from the file, the bottom of an oak chest in a Louisiana kitchen house, to a climate-controlled archive, where it can now be requested by anyone with a library card, is no minor detail. It is, in fact, immense. It tells us something about endurance, about the stubborn persistence of human intention, that ultimately feels more compelling than many of the brutalities the pages record. An ending that is also a beginning. When Dora sat in her kitchen in August 1857 and began to dictate her story, there were things she could not have foreseen. She could not have known the pages would outlast her. She hid them as carefully as she could, beneath beans and rice, beneath the ordinary substances of daily life. And then she lay down to sleep. Whatever hopes she carried about their future, she had no power to secure it. She did what she was able to do. The rest was beyond her. She could not have imagined that Celestine, a woman from the quarters who had shared countless evenings in that kitchen, eating Dora's food, talking and listening, would have a daughter, and that daughter another daughter, and that one day a descendant would clear out an old structure, struggle with a chest too heavy to move, and in doing so, alter the fate of a document that had waited 66 years to be found. She could not have known that the name August Fry, which she preserved for 2 years without fully grasping its significance, would later serve as the key that confirmed the credibility of everything else she said. Nor could she have anticipated that what she created over 9 nights, bent close to a fire with a 14-year-old boy carefully forming letters in a self-taught hand, would one day be read as more than testimony, that readers in another century would understand it as a map of how power arranges itself, and as evidence of the specific intelligence required to survive beneath it. Dora knew only what she knew. She knew the account was true. She knew it mattered. She knew she was weary of bearing it alone. So she spoke, and Lenny wrote. Across those 9 evenings, his handwriting changed. The letters steadied. The strokes grew more confident, as though the act of recording something weighty was itself a form of apprenticeship. By the final page, His script was measurably different from that on the first. Scholars who have examined the original pages have remarked upon this transformation. The hand that inscribed, "My name is Dora," above the date August 22nd, 1857, is firmer than the hand that began the narrative. What became of Lenny, whether he ever used that steadier hand again, in what life, under what circumstances, remains unknown. But for those 9 nights, he had it. The jasmine path behind the Bellhaven kitchen house is gone. The kitchen house itself no longer stands. The land has passed through successive owners and rearrangements. The 40-foot covered walkway Dora walked each day for 18 years, listening through open windows, has been absorbed into another landscape entirely, yet in an archive, within a building constructed for the preservation of such fragments, inside a folder, inside a box, inside a drawer. There are pages. They are fragile, worn by the humidity of a Louisiana kitchen that slowly defeated oiled cloth over decades. But they remain readable. The scholars who transcribed them did so meticulously, marking each gap, each blurred word, each place where time had thinned the ink. The surviving words are the ones Dora chose to speak, the ones Lenny chose to inscribe, and the ones an oak chest, through the accident of its design, managed to shelter. And in the margin of one of the middle pages, not in Lenny's hand but in another, smaller, more deliberate, there is a brief notation that has unsettled readers since the manuscript was first studied. It is not part of the dictated narrative.